The snow had no memory. It fell on the righteous and the damned with the same cold indifference, burying trails and erasing hope. Della knew this. She had been walking in it for 2 days, and her own tracks vanished behind her within minutes, as if the world was determined to forget she had ever existed at all. Her husband, Jed, would have liked that. He had often told her she was nothing, a ghost in his house. Now she was a ghost in the vast white wilderness of the Rockies, and the cold was making the threat a reality. Her boots, worn thin from the long journey west, were soaked through. Each step was a fresh agony of ice against bone. The gray wool of her cloak was stiff with frost, a useless weight that did little to block the wind. The wind was the worst part. It was a living thing, a predator that whispered of failure and sleep. A warm, final sleep. She clutched the small, nearly empty canvas sack to her chest. Inside was a half-eaten biscuit and a small tin of herbs her mother had given her years ago. Useless now. Everything was useless against the crushing white. She had run from Jed in the dead of night, leaving the small, dusty town in Nebraska with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate prayer. He had found her letters from her cousin in Oregon, had read her plans for escape. The beating had been worse than usual. It was the look in his eyes that had finally broken her fear, a look of ownership, as if he were planning not just to hurt her, but to dismantle her, piece by piece, until nothing was left. So she ran. She had paid a freight driver her last few dollars to take her as far as he was going, and he had dropped her at a crossroads 2 days ago, pointing vaguely west and wishing her luck with a pitying shake of his head. Now, luck had run out. She stumbled, her frozen feet catching on a hidden root beneath the powder. She fell hard, the impact jarring through her exhausted body. For a moment she just lay there, the snow a surprisingly soft bed. It would be so easy to close her eyes. Just for a minute. The wind's whisper became a lullaby. No more running. No more pain. Just the quiet and the white. She was sinking into it, a welcome surrender, when a sound cut through the howl of the storm. It was the sharp crack of a branch, too loud to be the wind. She forced her head up, her vision blurry with ice-caked lashes. A figure was moving through the trees, dark and immense against the snow. A man. He carried a rifle in one hand and a string of rabbits over his shoulder. He moved with a heavy, sure-footed gait, a creature of this unforgiving place. Fear, sharp and familiar, pierced the cold fog in her mind. It was a man, and men were the reason she was out here in the first place. She tried to push herself up, to run, to hide, but her limbs would not obey. The man stopped when he saw her, a small dark heap in the snow. He stood motionless for a long moment, and she could feel his gaze on her even from a distance. He was considering her, the way a wolf might consider a wounded deer. She expected him to turn and walk away, to leave her to the elements. It was what most people would do. It was what she deserved, perhaps, for being foolish enough to think she could escape. But he did not walk away. He began to move toward her, his steps deliberate, crushing the snow beneath his heavy boots. Asa saw the woman as a stain on the clean white canvas of his world. He had come up here, to this lonely mountain, to escape the mess of people. He had built his cabin with his own hands, timber by timber, to put a wall between himself and the world of heartache and betrayal that festered in the towns below. For 5 years, it had worked. His only companions were the pines, the snow, and the ghosts he kept locked inside his own chest. Now, this, a woman, half frozen and crumpled at the edge of his trapline. He stopped a few feet from her, his breath pluming in the frigid air. She was small, bundled in a threadbare cloak, her face pale as the snow she was lying in. He could see the faint blue tinge to her lips. She was close to the end. His first instinct, the one he had honed for 5 years, was to turn back. This was not his trouble. The mountain had its own brutal justice, and he had no right to interfere. Bringing her into his life, even for a day, would be like bringing a lit match into a powder keg. But then she moved. She pushed a hand against the snow, a gesture of such profound, hopeless effort that it cracked something in him. He saw the tremor in her arm, the sheer force of will it took to make that small movement. He remembered another woman, her hand gripping his, her strength fading with each passing moment. He had been helpless then. He had failed. He looked at the woman in the snow, and the ghost of his wife, Sarah, whispered in the wind. He could not save Sarah, but he could save this one. With a curse that was more a prayer, he strode forward. He knelt, shrugging the rabbits from his shoulder. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a rough growl from disuse. She flinched at the sound, her eyes fluttering open. They were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, a deep, clouded gray. He saw fear in them, and he saw a fight that had not quite been extinguished. "You aim to die out here." Della could not form words. Her jaw was too cold to move. She could only stare at him. He was a mountain of a man, with a thick, dark beard threaded with gray and eyes the color of moss. His face was a road map of hardship, carved by wind and sun and sorrow. He looked angry, but his hands, when he reached for her, were surprisingly careful. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. The sudden warmth of his body against her frozen one was a shock, a jolt of life that made her gasp. He smelled of pine smoke, leather, and cold air. He smelled of survival. "Hold on," he grunted and started walking. She was too weak to struggle, too cold to protest. She rested her head against the rough wool of his coat, the steady beat of his heart a drum against her ear. It was the first human warmth she had felt in what seemed like a lifetime. She closed her eyes, not in surrender to the snow, but in a fragile, terrifying flicker of trust. The mountain man was carrying her away, and for the first time in days, she did not know if she was running from something or toward it. She woke in pieces. First came the warmth, a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to be pulling her up from a great depth. Then came the pain, 1,000 sharp needles prickling at her skin as her blood began to move again. She moaned, a small sound that was swallowed by the crackle of a nearby fire. She forced her eyes open. She was lying on a pallet of furs near a large stone hearth. A fire blazed there, casting flickering orange light across a room made of rough-hewn logs. The cabin was one room, spare and ruthlessly tidy. A sturdy table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed was built into the far wall. Shelves held neatly stacked tins and jars. Tools hung from pegs. It was a man's space, built for function, not comfort. It felt like a fortress. Her wet cloak and dress were hanging from a line strung near the fire, steaming gently. She was dressed in a man's long shirt, the thick wool scratching against her skin but blessedly dry. The man, her rescuer, was sitting at the table cleaning his rifle. He worked with an intense, quiet focus, his large hands moving with practiced efficiency. He did not seem to have noticed she was awake. Della lay still, watching him, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. He had saved her. He had brought her here, stripped her of her wet clothes, and dressed her. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. But he was not looking at her. He seemed utterly absorbed in his task, a man alone with his work. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her. The movement caught his attention. He looked up, his moss-green eyes meeting hers. There was no warmth in them, only a flat, guarded assessment. "You're awake," he stated. It was not a question. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "My cabin," he said, returning his attention to the rifle. You were half dead a mile east of here. He did not elaborate. He did not ask her name or what she was doing in the middle of a blizzard. The silence stretched, filled only by the snap of the fire and the scrape of metal on metal. It was a deliberate silence, a wall he was building between them. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate. He gave a short, non-committal grunt in response. Della pushed herself up, ignoring the spinning in her head. She saw her small canvas sack on the floor by the hearth, where he must have set it. Relief washed over her. It contained little of value, but it was all she had. I should not be a burden. As soon as the weather clears." "Weather's not clearing." He cut her off, his voice flat. He gestured with his head toward the single window. "It's getting worse." She looked. The glass was frosted over, but she could see the furious swirl of white outside, and she could hear the wind, which had risen from a whisper to a howl. It sounded like a starved animal, clawing at the walls of the cabin. A deep dread settled in her stomach. She was trapped here. With him. He finished with the rifle and stood, his sheer size seeming to shrink the small room. He moved to the hearth and ladled something from a pot hanging over the fire into a wooden bowl. He wordlessly handed it to her. It was a thick stew, rich with the smell of rabbit and wild herbs. Her stomach clenched with a hunger so fierce it was painful. She took the bowl, her trembling hands barely able to hold it. "Eat," he commanded, then turned his back on her and went to stand by the window, staring out into the storm. Della ate, the hot stew warming her from the inside out. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. With each spoonful, she could feel a little more strength returning to her limbs. The man, Asa, as she had heard him mutter to himself, did not speak. He just stood like a statue, watching the storm rage. He was a man who seemed more comfortable with the violence of nature than with the presence of another human being. She wondered what had happened to him to make him build such high walls around himself. She knew about walls. She had been living inside them her whole life. The storm raged for another day. Asa remained distant, speaking only when necessary, his words clipped and functional. He chopped wood, tended the fire, and checked the security of the cabin with a grim efficiency. Della, regaining her strength, tried to make herself useful. She swept the hearth, tidied the shelves, and mended a tear in his coat she found hanging by the door. She worked in silence, acutely aware of his presence, of the way he would sometimes stop and watch her, his expression unreadable. On the third morning, the wind died down, and a pale, watery sunlight filtered through the window. The world outside was transformed, buried under a thick blanket of new snow. "Storms broke," Asa announced. "I'm riding to Redemption. It's a day's ride if the drifts aren't too bad. They have a boarding house. You can stay there." He was delivering her fate, not discussing it. He was eager to be rid of her. Della felt a pang of something she could not name. Disappointment? Fear? The thought of being alone again in a strange town with no money was terrifying. But she nodded. "Of course. I am grateful for your help, Mr." She trailed off, realizing she did not know his name. "Asa," he supplied, his back to her as he pulled on his heavy coat. He did not offer a surname. He was just Asa, the mountain man. He checked his saddlebags, packing a small amount of food. Della watched him, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. She went to the door and opened it a crack, peering outside. The air was still and painfully cold. The sky was a strange milky white. The snow on the pines was heavy, but it wasn't the fluffy powder of a normal snowfall. It was dense, packed by the wind. "You should wait," she said softly. Asa paused, turning to look at her. His expression was a mixture of annoyance and impatience. "The storm is over. I know this mountain." "The sky is wrong," she insisted, her voice gaining a little strength. Her father had been a trapper before he drank himself into an early grave, and he had taught her to read the world around her. And the wind, it hasn't gone. It's just taking a breath. Listen. He fell silent, and in the quiet, she could hear it. A low, almost imperceptible moan high in the peaks. It wasn't the sound of a dying storm. It was the sound of a new one gathering its strength. "It will be worse than the last one," she said. "You'll be caught in the open." He stared at her, his jaw tight. She could see the pride warring with the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He was the expert here. He was the mountain man. Who was she, a half-frozen stray, to tell him about his own territory? "I'll be fine," he said, his voice hard and final. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and opened the door. "Stay inside, keep the fire going." He strode out into the snow, leading his horse from the small lean-to that served as a stable. Della watched him go, her heart sinking. She watched as he mounted the horse and urged it into the deep snow, his figure shrinking against the vast white landscape. He was a powerful, capable man, but he was wrong. She knew it in her bones. The mountain didn't care how strong you were. It only cared if you listened. And Asa wasn't listening. For 2 hours, Della paced the small cabin. She fed the fire, her movements agitated. She kept going to the window, peering out at the unchanging white expanse. The sun vanished completely, swallowed by a bruised-looking sky. The wind began to pick up again, first as a whisper, then a rising shriek. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a blinding, horizontal sheet. The world outside the window disappeared into a churning vortex of white. He was out there in that. The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. He would be lost in minutes. The horse would panic. He would be disoriented, unable to see more than a few feet in front of him. He would freeze. He had saved her life, and now he was going to die because he had been too proud to listen to her. She could not let that happen. It was not a choice. It was a certainty. She had been a victim her whole life, passive and afraid, but not now. Not today. She pulled on her own still damp boots, wincing as the cold leather touched her skin. She wrapped her mended cloak around her shoulders and pulled the hood up. She found a coil of rope on a peg and slung it over her shoulder. She took the small axe from beside the hearth. She was not as strong as him, but she was not helpless. Her father had taught her more than just reading the sky. He had taught her how to survive. She opened the door and plunged into the blizzard. The force of the wind staggered her, and the cold was a physical blow, stealing her breath. For a moment she was blind and deaf, lost in the white roar, but she did not panic. She turned her back to the wind, planting her feet. She knew he couldn't have gone far. She remembered the direction he had headed. She began to walk, one slow, deliberate step at a time, her eyes scanning the ground, looking for any sign, any break in the pattern of the snow. The world was a chaos of white, but Della looked for the things beneath it. She kept a line of dark pines on her left, knowing they marked a ridge. She felt the ground slope beneath her feet, a subtle change that told her she was nearing the creek bed. Asa would have tried to follow the creek. It was the most logical path. The wind tried to push her off course, to confuse her, but she trusted her feet and her memory of the land. She called his name, her voice ripped away by the gale as soon as it left her lips. She found the horse first. The poor animal was standing broadside to the wind, shivering, its reins tangled in a low-hanging branch. There was no sign of Asa. Della's heart hammered against her ribs. She calmed the horse with a soft word and a gentle hand, untangling the reins. He couldn't be far. He must have fallen. She tied the horse to a sturdy tree and began to search, moving in a slow circle, her eyes scanning the drifts. And then she saw it. A flash of dark wool against the white, almost completely buried in a deep drift near the creek bank. It was his coat. She scrambled over, her hands digging frantically at the snow. She uncovered his shoulder, then his head. His eyes were closed, his beard caked with ice. He was terrifyingly still. She pressed her fingers against his neck, praying. For a heart-stopping second there was nothing. Then, a faint, thready pulse. He was alive. She grabbed his coat, pulling with all her might. He was a dead weight, far too heavy for her to lift. Asa! She screamed into the wind, her voice raw. Asa, wake up! She slapped his cheek, the sting of it sharp even through the cold. His eyelids fluttered. He groaned, his eyes opening a fraction. They were glazed, unfocused. Lost? He mumbled, his voice thick. Can't see. I can, she said, her voice firm, willing her own strength into him. I can see. You have to get up. You have to walk. She looped the rope under his arms and around his chest, then used a tree for leverage, pulling until he was in a sitting position. He slumped against her, his body shaking with cold. We are not dying here, Asa, she said, her lips close to his ear. Not today. Now, on your feet. Somehow he did it. Leaning on her, using her as a crutch, he staggered to his feet. He was dazed, his movements clumsy, but he was moving. She got him to the horse, and together they began the slow journey back. She did not lead the horse. She led him. She walked in front, breaking the trail, her small form a shield against the worst of the wind. She did not use a compass or the sun. She used the trees, the feel of the land, the subtle memory of the path. She was the one who knew the way. She was leading the mountain man home through a storm that would have killed him. And as they struggled through the blinding white, she knew, with a certainty that warmed her to the bone, that she was no longer a ghost. The cabin was a sanctuary, a warm, fire-lit haven against the raging storm. Getting Asa inside had taken the last of Della's strength. He had collapsed onto the floor, and she had dragged him, inch by painful inch, to the hearth. Now he lay on the fur pallet, stripped of his frozen coat and boots, wrapped in every blanket she could find. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering, his skin a deathly pale. Della worked with a desperate, focused energy. She stoked the fire until it was roaring, the heat pushing back the cabin's chill. She filled the kettle with snow and put it on to boil. While it heated, she knelt beside him. She began rubbing his hands and feet, trying to force circulation back into the frozen flesh. His skin was like ice. He was barely conscious, muttering deliriously. She saw the dark patches of frostbite on his fingertips and the tips of his ears. It was bad. If she didn't warm him carefully, the tissue would die. She remembered her father coming home once in a similar state. Her mother had known what to do. Della filled a bowl with lukewarm water from the kettle, testing it carefully with her elbow. She gently submerged his hands, murmuring to him, soft, soothing sounds, the way one would to a frightened animal. He flinched as sensation began to return, a low groan rumbling in his chest. His eyes opened, and this time they focused on her. He stared at her small hands holding his much larger ones in the bowl of water. He looked at her face, her hair damp with melted snow, her expression one of fierce concentration. He saw no fear, only purpose. You came back for me, he whispered, his voice raspy. You were a fool to go, she replied, her tone sharp, but her touch was gentle as she dried his hands and began to wrap them in strips of clean cloth. You're lucky I'm a better listener than you are. There was no triumph in her words, only a deep, bone-weary relief. He did not argue. He simply watched her, his gaze intense. He had lived his life by the creed of self-reliance. To need help was to be weak. To accept it was a humiliation. Yet here he was, utterly dependent on the stray woman he had planned to discard. She had not only saved his life, she had done it with a competence that humbled him. She knew the mountain in a way he did not. He knew its brute force, its grand gestures. She knew its secrets, its whispers. For the next 3 days, the blizzard held them captive. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin. A strange, quiet intimacy grew in the confined space. Della nursed him, tending to his frostbite, brewing him herbal teas that eased the ache in his bones, and cooking nourishing broths. He watched her move about the cabin, her quiet efficiency turning his stark shelter into something that felt perilously like a home. She organized his shelves, her touch bringing a gentle order to his chaotic stores. She mended his clothes with neat, almost invisible stitches. She did not fill the silence with chatter, but her presence was a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Asa, for his part, began to thaw, and not just from the cold. He started talking, at first in short, grudging sentences, then in longer stretches. He told her the names of the peaks visible from his window. He showed her how to properly sharpen a skinning knife. One afternoon, as she was kneading dough for bread, he spoke of his wife. Her name was Sarah, he said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the fire. She died in this room, in that bed. Della's hands stilled in the floury dough. The baby came too soon. A boy. He didn't last the night. Asa's hands clenched into fists on his knees. The midwife was snowed in. The doctor was a 2-day ride away. There was nothing I could do. I built this place for her, to keep her safe. And it killed her. The guilt was a raw, open wound in his voice. Della came and sat in the other chair, her hands dusted with flour. She did not offer empty platitudes. She just sat with him in his grief, her quiet presence a testament that he was no longer alone with his ghosts. My pa used to say that some things are too heavy to carry alone, she said softly. Looks like you've been trying to carry a whole mountain by yourself. He looked at her then, and she saw the walls in his eyes crumble, just for a moment. He saw not a burden, not a complication, but a woman who understood the language of loss. Later that evening, he got up from his chair and came over to where she sat by the fire, mending a shirt. He took a small, carved wooden bird from the mantelpiece and pressed it into her hand. It was worn smooth, with handling. Sarah carved this, he said. She loved the wrens in the summer. It was an offering, a piece of his shuttered heart. Della closed her fingers around the small bird, its wooden warmth seeping into her skin. It was a gesture more intimate than any touch they had shared. She was beginning to fall for this broken, silent man, and the realization terrified her. He was a man of the wilderness, and she was a woman on the run. There was no future for them. There was only this stolen time, this quiet space between storms. One night, he woke with a shout, thrashing in his bed, caught in the grip of a nightmare. Della was by his side in an instant, a hand on his shoulder. Asa, she said, her voice calm and steady. Asa, you're here. You're safe. His eyes flew open, wild and lost. He stared at her, his chest heaving. The shadows of his past were clinging to him. He reached out, his hand gripping her arm, not with force, but with a desperate need for an anchor in the dark. Don't go, he whispered, the sound raw. I'm not going anywhere, she promised, and sat on the edge of the bed until his breathing evened out and he fell back into a peaceful sleep, his hand still loosely holding her arm. She did not pull away. For the first time since she had fled Nebraska, she felt truly safe. She was in a mountain man's cabin with a man haunted by death, but the real monster was miles away, or so she hoped. When the storm finally broke for good, a week after it had begun, the silence it left behind was deafening. The sun shone on a world of pristine, glittering white. It was beautiful, but it was also the end of their seclusion. The path to redemption would be clear. Asa was quiet that morning, his mood dark and withdrawn. The walls were going back up. He moved with a restless energy, avoiding her eyes. "I'll take you to town tomorrow," he said, his voice flat. The words felt like a dismissal. Their time was over. Reality was intruding. Della's heart ached, but she simply nodded, her own walls sliding back into place. She had been a fool to think this could be anything more than a temporary shelter. They spent the day in a strained silence, both of them acutely aware of the coming separation. The easy rhythm they had found was gone, replaced by a clumsy awareness of each other. That afternoon, as Della was sweeping the hearth, she saw a figure on horseback approaching the cabin. It was not Asa's powerful build. This man was slighter, moving with an unfamiliar gait. Asa saw him too. He stiffened, his hand going instinctively to the knife on his belt. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice a low growl. He stepped out onto the small porch, his body blocking the doorway. The man rode closer and Della's blood ran cold. She knew that posture. She knew the tilt of that hat. The world seemed to tilt with it, the safe walls of the cabin dissolving around her. The man reined in his horse, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face as he saw Asa. "I'm looking for my wife," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. It was a voice that had haunted her nightmares, smooth and pleasant on the surface, but laced with venom. Small woman, gray eyes, answers to the name Della, saw tracks leading this way. "You seen her?" It was Jed. Her past had found her. The storm outside was over, but the one inside was just beginning. Jed's presence was a poison that seeped through the sturdy logs of the cabin. He dismounted, his movements confident, proprietary. He looked past Asa, his eyes locking on Della, who stood frozen in the shadows of the doorway. His smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. They were flat and cold, the eyes of a man assessing property. "There you are, my dear," he said, his voice dripping with false affection. "Had me worried half to death." Asa did not move. He was a wall of muscle and fury between Jed and the cabin. "She's not going with you," he said, his voice a low rumble. Jed chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "I believe that's for my wife to decide, though the law might have something to say about it. A man's wife is his property, after all. And you, friend, appear to be in possession of stolen goods." He held up a piece of paper. "I have our marriage lines right here, recognized in any territory in this union. Now, are you going to step aside, or is the sheriff in redemption going to have to come up here and drag you off this mountain in chains?" The threat hung in the air, heavy and real. Asa was strong, but he was one man against the law. Jed was right. In the eyes of the world, Della belonged to him. She saw the conflict in Asa's face, the rage warring with the bitter truth. He could fight Jed, and he might even win, but he would lose in the end. He would be an outlaw, a kidnapper. She had brought this trouble to his door, and she would not see him destroyed by it. Stepping out from behind Asa, her voice trembling but clear, she said, "It's all right, Jed. I'll come with you." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Asa turned to look at her, his face a mask of disbelief and betrayal. "Della, no," he said, his voice ragged. "I will not be the reason you lose your home," she said, looking at him, trying to convey a message with her eyes that she could not speak aloud. "This is not surrender. This is a retreat." "Thank you for your kindness, Asa," she said formally, the words a knife in her own heart. She walked past him, refusing to let herself falter, and went to the horse Jed was holding for her. She did not look back as she mounted. She could not bear to see the look on Asa's face. Jed gave Asa a final triumphant smirk. "Pleasure doing business with you," he said, and with a tug on the reins, he led her away from the cabin, away from the only place she had ever felt safe. The journey down the mountain was a descent into hell. Jed did not speak to her, but she could feel his anger radiating from him like heat from a stove. He was saving it. He liked to draw things out. That night they made a cold camp in a small clearing. Jed drank from a flask of whiskey, his silence growing more menacing with every swallow. Della knew what was coming. It was a pattern as old as their marriage. The silence, the drinking, then the rage. But something in her had changed. The woman who had fled Nebraska was not the same woman who had survived a blizzard and led a man home from the brink of death. Asa stood on his porch and watched them go until they were just a dark speck against the snow. The silence that descended was absolute, a crushing weight. The cabin, which had felt like a home just an hour before, was now an empty, echoing tomb. He saw her mending on the chair, smelled the faint scent of the herbs she used, heard the ghost of her quiet footsteps. He had let her go. He had stood by and let that snake take her, all because of a piece of paper and a threat. He went inside and slammed the door, the sound echoing his own self-loathing. He had retreated back into his shell, back into the cold, safe numbness he had cultivated for 5 years. It was better this way, he told himself. She was a part of the world he had left behind. She would have been a constant danger, a constant reminder of what he could lose. But the lie offered no comfort. The cold he felt now was 1,000 times worse than the blizzard's chill. It was the cold of a hollowed-out soul. He had chosen safety over her. He had failed again. He sat by the cold hearth all night, the ghosts of Sarah and his son joined by a new one, a ghost with winter sky eyes and a quiet strength that had called to the deepest part of him. He had found something on this mountain he thought was lost forever, and he had let it walk away. The sun rose, and with it came a terrible clarity. The mountain he had been carrying, the one Della had spoken of, was not his grief for Sarah. It was his fear. Fear of losing, fear of trying, fear of living. He looked at the small wooden wren Sarah had carved, which Della had left on the mantel. He picked it up. This cabin was not a fortress. It was a prison he had built for himself. Della had not brought trouble. She had brought life. She had saved him from the storm, yes, but she had also saved him from himself. And he had let her go back to a man who would surely destroy her. A cold, clean rage burned through him, melting away the years of fear and grief. He would not fail again. He strode to the door, his movements filled with a purpose he had not felt in years. He put on his coat, grabbed his rifle, and went to the lean-to. He saddled his horse with swift, efficient movements. He did not know what he would do. He did not care about the law or the consequences. He only knew one thing. He could not live in a world where she was not safe. He rode out, following their tracks in the snow, a man no longer running from his past, but riding toward his future. Della waited. She watched Jed drink, her mind sharp and clear. She was no longer the frightened creature he had married. She had faced down death in a blizzard. Jed was just a man, and a drunken one at that. When he finally lunged for her, his eyes glazed with whiskey and malice, she was ready. She did not fight him with strength. She fought him with knowledge. She dodged his clumsy grasp, grabbing the hot coffee pot from the fire and flinging its contents in his face. He screamed, stumbling back, clawing at his eyes. In that moment of surprise, she acted. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet and swung it with all her might, connecting with the side of his head. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. She did not hesitate. She took his gun from its holster, checked to see that it was loaded, and tucked it into the waistband of her skirt. She took his money, his horse, and the small bag of food he carried. She did not run blindly. She mounted the horse and began to backtrack, her mind working calmly. She would not go to Oregon. Jed would expect that. She would disappear into these mountains, live off the land. She could do it. She knew she could. She had been riding for an hour when she heard the sound of another horse approaching, fast. Her heart leaped into her throat. Had Jed woken so soon? She pulled the horse into a thicket of pines, drawing the pistol, her hand steady. The rider came into view. It was Asa. He was riding hard, his face set in a grim, determined line. He was not the hesitant, walled-off man she had left. This was a man on a mission, a man who had made a choice. He saw her at the same moment she saw him, pulling his horse to a sudden halt. They stared at each other across the snow-covered clearing, the space between them charged with unspoken emotion. "Della," he breathed, his voice thick with relief. He swung down from his horse, his eyes searching her, looking for any sign of harm. "I came back. I couldn't." "You don't have to," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. She held up the pistol. "I saved myself." He stopped, and a look of profound respect, of awe dawned on his face. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a woman who needed rescuing, but an equal, a partner. "I see that," he said, his own slow smile mirroring hers. A noise from down the trail made them both turn. Jed was coming, staggering on foot, his face red and blistered, a look of pure murder in his eyes. "You witch!" he roared, pulling a knife from his boot. "I'll kill you both!" Asa stepped in front of Della, raising his rifle. "That's far enough, Jed." "She's my wife! The law is on my side!" Jed screamed, advancing. "The law ain't on this mountain," Asa said, his voice cold as ice. "Up here, there's just what's right, and you ain't it." He did not fire the rifle. He stood his ground, a human shield. But it was Della who ended it. She raised her pistol, the barrel unwavering. "It's over, Jed," she said, her voice ringing with a strength he had never heard before. "I am not your wife. I am not your property. And I will not go back." Her certainty, more than any weapon, was what defeated him. He saw it in her eyes. The woman he had terrorized was gone. He hesitated, his crazed advance faltering. In that moment, he was no longer the monster. He was just a pathetic, angry man who had lost control. He spat on the ground, turned, and stumbled back the way he had come, defeated. Silence returned to the forest. Asa lowered his rifle, his eyes never leaving Della's face. He had ridden to save her, but in the end, they had stood together. He had been willing to face the law for her, and she had been willing to face her monster for herself. The rescue was mutual. He closed the distance between them, his hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. "I believe you have a choice to make," he said softly. "The trail to Oregon is that way. Or, the trail back to my cabin is the other." Della looked down the long, lonely trail west, toward a future she had once dreamed of. Then she looked at Asa, at his strong, gentle hand on her face, at the home she saw in his moss-green eyes. She had been running for so long. She was tired of running. She leaned into his touch, a silent answer that he understood completely. "I think," she said, her voice steady and sure, "I'm already home." The seasons turned on the mountain. Winter's harsh white softened into the tender green of spring, then ripened into the gold of summer. The cabin, once a monument to one man's grief, became a home filled with the quiet rhythms of a shared life. Asa taught Della how to track a buck and how to read the clouds for rain. Della taught Asa how to laugh again, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to shake the dust from the rafters. She planted a garden of herbs and vegetables in a small plot of cleared land, her hands coaxing life from the stubborn mountain soil. Asa built her a small shelf inside the cabin door for her drying herbs. He did it one afternoon while she was away, his large hands carefully sanding the pine boards smooth. When she returned and saw it, her jars of yarrow and chamomile already arranged neatly upon it, she said nothing. She simply went to him and placed her hand on his arm, and in that touch, A universe of gratitude was exchanged. He was a man who spoke with his hands, and she had learned to understand his language perfectly. They were a team. When a late frost threatened her garden, he was out there beside her, helping her cover the delicate plants with blankets. When he cut his leg badly with an axe, she stitched the wound with a steady hand by candlelight, her calm competence a balm to his pain. He had saved her from the snow, and she had saved him from the storm. But their real rescue was a daily act, a quiet mending of each other's broken pieces. One summer evening, they sat on the porch he had extended, watching the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air was warm, scented with pine and the sweet smell of the flowers she had planted in window boxes. Asa was whittling, a new wooden bird taking shape under his knife. He had given her a whole flock of them, which now sat perched on the mantelpiece. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, his voice quiet. "The world down below, towns, people." Della considered the question. She thought of the noise, the judgment, the cold stares of strangers. She thought of Jed and the life she had fled. Then she looked at the vast, peaceful wilderness that stretched before them, at the man beside her, his presence as solid and comforting as the mountain itself. "The world is full of people," she said, "but it's mighty empty of peace. I've found my peace right here." He stopped his whittling and looked at her, his eyes soft in the fading light. He reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It was a simple gesture, but it held the weight of a lifetime of promises. The frontier was still wild, the winters were still hard, but they were no longer alone. He was no longer just a mountain man, and she was no longer a woman on the run. They were two people who had found their shelter in each other. His cabin was no longer a prison of the past, but a foundation for the future. He had been a man who thought love was something you lose. She had shown him that true love is something you build, day by day, gesture by gesture, like a sturdy cabin that can withstand any storm. And as the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky, they sat in comfortable silence, two hearts that had finally and truly led each other home. Stories like these remind us that even in the harshest wilderness, the human heart can find a place to thrive, and that sometimes the person who saves us is the one we least expect. If you've ever found strength you didn't know you had, or found a home in an unexpected place, let us know in the comments below. We love hearing your stories, and for more tales of love and survival on the frontier, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring that bell so you never miss a new story. Have you ever had to trust a stranger the way Della trusted Asa? Think on that, and we'll see you next time.